This is an introduction to Module 6 from Making Spatial Decisions using GIS and Remote Sensing, and we're going to talk about supervised classification. So here's an example of a training sample manager, which is a window which will open up in your ArcMap session, and you will be drawing polygons around specific land covers. These are color coded, and you can see that wetland is highlighted and the polygons are drawn around wetland areas in the Landsat image. So supervised classification is a process that involves collecting samples of the classes that will appear in your final map. These are also called training classes. An image classification approach that is based on the training samples collected by the analyst is one way to define this. And so in essence, the training samples are teaching the software how to classify the rest of the pixels in the image. Here's an example of a raw image from a 4-band Landsat TM image of the northern area of Cincinnati, Ohio. And these were the areas that were identified in this image: commercial, industrial, residential, cropland, forest, and pasture. You can see that there is a green outline around some of the areas in this image, and that is representing pastures. So what you will be doing is analyzing the quality of samples using histograms and scatter plots. So histograms show the distribution of digital numbers per band, bands 1 through 4 in this example, and then the scatter plot also shows a comparison between two different bands, which you can see in the bottom examples, and they are color coded to match your training sample manager. So the histograms and scatter plots are tools that are available in ArcMap. So here is a bigger image of histograms, and again the colors are going to match the colors that are showing in your training sample manager, and in ArcMap colors will show up by default. In the training sample manager you can change the colors if you want to match more closely to the type of area that you've identified. You can see here that this is a comparison between the different bands, and for example, if we look at the one in the upper right, we have the green band and it's showing the digital numbers. You can clearly see water is lower in the digital number values, and we would expect this if we think about the spectral signature of water. So it's a high absorber, so most of those digital numbers are down in the lower range of numbers that we see on the x-axis, whereas wetland is higher. And then for the still looking at the green band, we can also see some of the forest there. And so you're going to be using the histograms to think about the training classes that you've created. So students will often ask me, how many training classes do I need to create? It's an iterative process, and you need to keep doing it until you get good results. I know as a new user that it may not be clear what good results are, but just keep practicing and know that for the purposes of this lab that we are focusing on technique, you don't want to spend endless hours working on your training sample classes, but you do want to use histograms and scatter plots in order to understand your quality of your training samples. So here's an example of scatter plots, and they are comparing the values between two bands. So in the upper left we're comparing the blue band versus the green band. In the upper right we have the blue band versus the red band. And when you select a training class, as this example is selected forest and wetland, you can see them compared in the bands. Looking at this example, you can see that there's a great deal of overlap in the blue and the near infrared when we consider forest and wetland. but there's a little bit more separation in the blue versus the green. And so that is going to make sense because in blue versus green, we're looking at forest is going to be very different than wetland. But when we consider that blue versus the near infrared, there's not a great deal of difference. You'll create a signature file in this lab. It records the spectrum signatures of different classes across a series of bands. And so for each class, a signature is going to contain some statistical information of means and covariances calculated from its training sample. Your signature file is an ASCII2 file, and it stores these multivariate statistics for each class or cluster. And it includes the mean for each class or cluster, the number of cells, and the variance and covariance matrix for the class or cluster. So the signature file provides information to ArcMap on how to classify the entire scene based on the training sample managers you have drawn. You're going to be using maximum likelihood classification using spectral signatures. So here's an example from your lab, and you will visually be identifying these areas. You don't want to have your training samples too large. You want to be pretty confident about the training samples that you're drawing, and you will do this with visual analysis. You will need to submit a quantitative comparison, and quantitative means to compare the numbers. Here is an example of percent of land cover by classification type, and this is for your reference only. Your numbers will vary according to the samples that you draw. When you compare supervised versus unsupervised, let's think about unsupervised advantages. You don't have to have any knowledge of the study area before you perform your analysis, and the spectral response units are automatically recognized by the computer. The disadvantages are that the clusters do not necessarily correspond to desired features, so the computer might put digital numbers together that don't represent an actual class in the real world, and you don't have any control over the classes that are created. So why would you, or when would you use unsupervised classification? When an analyst is short on time and does not have firsthand knowledge of an area. So it is a technique that is used in the real world. Both unsupervised and supervised are often used, and there is a use for both types of analysis. Supervised classification has the advantage that the remote sensing analyst will determine the clusters. You can add additional training sites or signatures as needed, and the disadvantage is that it's labor intensive, and the analyst will impose structure and may introduce bias, and that is just something to account for and know ahead of time. So when would you use supervised classification? When the remote sensing analyst has knowledge of the study area or has access to high resolution imagery. So in this case, you have access to the Landsat imagery. You can also use Google Earth for this lab and also for your projects if you decide to do supervised classification. Something to keep in mind is a mixed pixel, and it's defined as an area or a pixel that represents more than one spectral class within the area it covers on the ground. It's shown here as a mixture of a yellow land cover class and a blue land cover class. This is very common on shorelines of lakes, oceans, water bodies, and especially common with wetlands. And a mixed pixel will affect the accuracy of the classification. And this concludes Module 6 Introduction.